In a crowded high school gymnasium in suburban Denver, a quiet teen in a wheelchair was about to become the target of a cruel spectacle. A championship assembly turned deadly serious when arrogant varsity bullies turned their attention from victory. Lapse to humiliation. Steven Seagal wasn't your typical family visitor. For decades, he was an elite martial artist, aikido master, an international action icon known for dismantling enemies with discipline and precision. When the bullies spun Ian Mercer's wheelchair in front of a stunned crowd, they had no idea. They were provoking the godfather of the boy they'd humiliated and stepping directly into a moral reckoning. Steven didn't storm in fists first. He issued a quiet, calculated presence that would shatter a school's culture of silence. What began as a routine school celebration would become a moment of public transformation. The halls of Westridge High would never be the same after Steven Seagal walked through its doors and demonstrated that real strength means protecting those who need protection most. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gymnasium lights blazed overhead, bathing every face in harsh fluorescence that made the polished floor gleam like a mirror. Students packed the bleachers shoulder to shoulder, a sea of blue and gold school colors rippling with restless energy. Banners hung from the rafters like battle flags. Regional Champions 2025 in bold letters that seemed to pulse with the thunderous music thumping through the speakers. Westridge High hadn't seen excitement like this in years. The soccer team's regional championship victory had transformed an ordinary Tuesday assembly into something electric, something that made the walls themselves seem to vibrate with teenage triumph. Voices blended into a deafening roar that bounced off every surface, creating a cacophony of celebration that left ears ringing and hearts racing. Principal Ms. Hartley stood at center court, microphone in hand, her professional smile bright but somehow tight at the edges. She'd rehearsed this speech 3 times that morning, seeking the perfect balance of enthusiasm and administrative authority. Her navy blazer was pressed to perfection, her auburn hair styled in a way that suggested both approachability and control. "Westridge High," she announced, her voice cutting through the chaos with practiced precision. "Today we celebrate excellence." The crowd erupted again, a tsunami of teenage voices that seemed to lift the very roof. She waited, perfectly poised in her charcoal pants and sensible heels, until the noise settled into something manageable. Her eyes swept the gymnasium, taking in the faces of her students, the pride of her faculty, the satisfaction of a job well done. "Our Westridge Warriors didn't just win a game," she continued, her voice rising with genuine enthusiasm. "They showed us what determination looks like. They showed us what it means to represent our school with pride and perseverance." In the front row of the bleachers, Jake Redding nudged Marco De Leon, both boys wearing their varsity jackets like armor. Jake's smirk grew wider as Principal Hartley continued her praise, his knee bouncing with the restless energy of someone who lived for moments like this. All eyes on him, all attention focused on his achievements. His blonde hair was perfectly styled, his posture radiating the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place at the top of the social hierarchy. "Damn right," he whispered to Marco, his voice carrying just enough to reach nearby students. "We carried this whole school on our backs." Marco grinned back, his dark eyes bright with reflected glory. He was broader than Jake, his Mexican heritage evident in his warm brown skin and the way his smile seemed to light up his entire face. The scholarship offers had been pouring in since the championship, and for a kid from the east side of Denver, whose parents cleaned office buildings at night, this felt like stepping into a dream. Across the gym, pressed against the wall beneath the scoreboard, Ian Mercer adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and shifted slightly in his wheelchair. The space was cramped, not exactly designed for accessibility, but he'd grown accustomed to making himself smaller in crowded places. His chair was a sleek manual model, the kind that spoke of both necessity and pride, functional without being flashy, efficient without drawing attention. Ian's blue eyes were thoughtful behind his glasses as he watched the celebration unfold. A biology textbook rested on his lap, marked with sticky notes and marginalia that revealed a curious mind always working. He'd closed it when the assembly began, but his fingers drummed absently against its worn cover. He clapped when others clapped, smiled when others smiled. But his expression remained neutral, not bored, not particularly excited, just present in the way of someone who'd learned to observe rather than participate. Naomi Field slipped into the narrow space beside him, her camera hanging around her neck like a badge of office. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy bun secured with what looked like a pencil, and her fingers were stained with the kind of ink that came from old-fashioned darkroom processing. She was one of the few students who still believed in film photography, who thought digital couldn't capture the soul of a moment. "Mind if I stand here?" she asked, adjusting her camera settings. Best angle for photos of the team. Ian shifted his chair slightly to make room, a gesture so automatic it seemed unconscious. "Sure thing. Get your shots." Naomi raised her camera, focusing on Principal Hartley, but her eyes occasionally drifted to Ian's profile. There was something about his quiet dignity that drew her photographer's eye, something that spoke of stories untold and strength measured in different ways. "This whole thing's a bit much, don't you think?" she whispered, clicking off a few shots of the crowd's enthusiasm. Ian shrugged, his expression remaining neutral. "It makes people happy. Nothing wrong with celebrating achievement." "And now," Principal Hartley announced, her voice rising with practiced enthusiasm, "please welcome the young men who made history possible, our regional championship team, led by co-captains Jake Redding and Marco De Leon." The gymnasium exploded into chaos. Students stamped their feet on the bleachers, creating a rhythm that seemed to shake the building's foundation. Teachers clapped politely from their designated section, their smiles genuine but measured. Coach Simmons stood from his seat behind the team, arms crossed over his broad chest, a satisfied nod directed at his star players. His weathered face, marked by decades of Colorado sun and countless practices, showed the deep satisfaction of a man who'd finally achieved the success that had eluded him for years. Jake and Marco jogged to center court, their movements confident and theatrical. Jake grabbed the microphone first, his stride that of someone born to be in the spotlight. His varsity jacket hung open over his chest, the championship patch gleaming under the harsh lights. "What's up, Westridge?" he shouted into the microphone, his voice echoing off the walls. The crowd roared back, a wall of sound that seemed to feed his energy. Jake soaked it in, arms spread wide like a conductor directing an orchestra of adolescent excitement. "Did anybody doubt us?" he continued, his voice dropping to a dramatic whisper that somehow carried through the gym. "Because I sure didn't." More cheers, more stamping feet, more faces turned toward him with expressions of adoration and envy. This was Jake's element, his natural habitat, the center of attention, the golden boy who could do no wrong. "We want to thank everyone who supported us," Jake continued, his eyes scanning the crowd with practiced charm. "Especially the real fans who never missed a game, who cheered us on through rain and snow and everything in between." His pause was perfectly timed, a moment of silence that drew every ear in the gymnasium. "And to those who didn't believe," he said, his smirk widening, "how does it feel to be wrong?" Laughter rippled through the gym, the kind of nervous laughter that comes when someone says something just sharp enough to cut. Even Principal Hartley smiled, though something flickered behind her eyes, a brief moment of unease at Jake's tone, a question about where confidence crossed the line into arrogance. Jake passed the microphone to Marco, who mumbled a few genuine thanks to the coaches and parents, his humility a stark contrast to Jake's showmanship. But everyone knew Marco was just the warm-up act, the opening band before the main event. When Jake took the microphone back, he paced the court like he owned it, his movements fluid and commanding. The crowd hung on his every word, every gesture, every carefully calculated moment of drama. "You know what they say," Jake continued, his voice dropping to that same dramatic whisper that had worked so well before. "Champions aren't born, they're built." He flexed dramatically, his biceps straining against his jacket, and the crowd went wild. More cheers, more laughter, more worship of the golden boy who seemed to embody everything Westridge High wanted to be. But as Jake's gaze swept the crowd, basking in their adoration, something shifted in his expression. His eyes had found Ian, sitting quietly in his wheelchair against the wall, and for just a moment, something flickered across Jake's face. A narrowing of the eyes, a slight curl of the lip that suggested he'd spotted an opportunity. The celebration continued around them, But for Ian, watching Jake's expression change, the mood in the gymnasium suddenly felt different. The lights seemed harsher, the noise more aggressive, the space more confining. And from across the gym, Jake Redding smiled. With the official speeches concluded, the rigid structure of the assembly dissolved into something more organic and dangerous. Students began to move freely around the gymnasium floor, clustering in groups that reflected the complex social geography of high school life. The soccer team found themselves surrounded by admirers, underclassmen wanting selfies, cheerleaders offering congratulations, and the general population of students who gravitated toward success like moths to a flame. Jake reveled in the attention, his varsity jacket drawing eyes like a magnet. He signed programs, posed for pictures, and basked in the kind of adoration that had become as essential to him as oxygen. Marco stood beside him, equally popular but somehow more uncomfortable with the spotlight. His responses more genuine, less calculated. Coach Simmons worked the crowd too, shaking hands with parents and accepting congratulations from fellow faculty members. His weathered face showed the satisfaction of a man who'd finally silenced his critics, who'd proven that his methods and his team could deliver when it mattered most. Naomi moved through the crowd with her camera, documenting the celebration with the eye of someone who saw beyond the surface. She captured the obvious moments, the triumphant poses, the broad smiles, the clasped hands, and congratulatory embraces. But she also found the subtler images, the substitute players standing slightly apart from their starting teammates, the students who watched the celebration from the edges, the complex emotions that rippled beneath the surface of collective joy. It was during one of these quieter moments that Jake's attention drifted from his admirers to Ian, who remained in his spot against the wall. The biology textbook was open on his lap again, and he seemed absorbed in reading about cellular mitosis while the celebration swirled around him. There was something about Ian's self-containment that drew Jake's attention, not admiration, but something darker, something that saw isolation as opportunity. "Hey, Professor Wheels," Jake called out, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of conversation and laughter. The nickname had started freshman year, delivered with what Jake insisted was playful affection, but which carried an edge that made it feel like something else entirely. Ian looked up from his textbook, his expression neutral but alert. He'd heard the nickname before, had learned to navigate these moments with the careful diplomacy of someone who understood the social dynamics at play. "Congratulations on the championship," Ian said, his voice steady and sincere. "Hell of a game." Jake's smile broadened, but there was something predatory in it now, something that suggested he'd found his entertainment for the post-assembly period. Marco followed behind him, his expression less certain, his comfort with the situation already beginning to crack. "Thanks, man," Jake said, his voice carrying that false warmth that teenagers used when they wanted to appear magnanimous. "You catch it on TV? I mean, I know you probably couldn't make it to the actual game." The comment hung in the air like a challenge disguised as concern. Ian's wheelchair was certainly capable of navigating the school's athletic facilities, but Jake's implication was clear. Some people belonged at victories, others belonged watching from the sidelines. "Actually, I was there," Ian replied, his tone remaining level. "Front row behind the bench. Great header for the winning goal." For a moment, Jake's expression flickered with something that might have been embarrassment, but it was quickly replaced by something harder. He couldn't be shown up by someone he designated as beneath him, couldn't allow his attempted dominance to be deflected so easily. "That's cool," Jake said, stepping closer to Ian's wheelchair. "Always good to have our biggest fans supporting us, even if they can't really understand what it feels like to be out there competing." Marco shifted uncomfortably beside him, his eyes darting between Jake and Ian. The crowd around them had begun to notice the interaction, conversations quieting as people sensed the shift in atmosphere. Naomi had been photographing a group of cheerleaders when she heard Jake's voice take on that particular tone. She turned, her camera still hanging around her neck, and saw the small crowd beginning to form around Ian and Jake. Something cold settled in her stomach as she recognized the signs of what was about to happen. "Competition comes in different forms," Ian said, his voice still measured but with a slight edge that suggested his patience was being tested. "Some people compete on the field, others in the lab, others in the classroom. Success isn't limited to one arena." Jake's smirk widened, and he exchanged a look with Marco that carried the weight of shared understanding. They'd found their entertainment, their way to extend the day's triumph into something more personal and immediate. "You're right," Jake said, his voice dropping to that conversational tone that somehow made his words feel more dangerous. Like, "I bet you could build a robot to stand up for you." "Oh, wait." He paused, his smile becoming genuinely cruel. "You needed to stand up for you, wouldn't you?" The laughter that followed was nervous, uncertain, the kind of laughter that comes when people aren't sure if they're witnessing humor or cruelty, but feel pressured to respond anyway. Some students looked away, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Others leaned in, drawn by the spectacle of conflict. Ian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "I think you might be surprised what I can do for myself." Jake's response was to step even closer, his hand reaching out to grasp the handle of Ian's wheelchair. "Oh, I'm sure you're very capable," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "Here, let me help you get a better view of the celebration." What happened next occurred in slow motion for everyone watching. Jake gently tugged Ian's chair forward, then pushed it back more quickly than necessary. The movement was subtle enough to appear accidental, but forceful enough to make Ian lurch backward, his textbook sliding off his lap and his hands gripping the armrests to steady himself. The crowd's reaction was immediate and mixed, some nervous laughter, a few gasps of surprise, and a palpable sense of unease that rippled through the gathered students. Ian's face flushed, not with embarrassment, but with the kind of anger that comes from being made helpless in front of peers. "Just messing around, man," Jake said quickly, his voice carrying the kind of false joviality that was meant to deflect criticism. "Don't be so serious. It's a celebration." But something had shifted in the gymnasium's atmosphere. The innocent fun of the post-assembly celebration had curdled into something uglier, something that made students exchange uncomfortable glances and teachers begin to pay closer attention. Marco's laughter sounded forced now, his discomfort evident, in the way he kept glancing toward the exits. Naomi had raised her camera instinctively, her photographer's reflexes capturing the moment before her conscience could intervene. Coach Simmons watched from across the gym, his arms still crossed, his expression unreadable. Principal Hartley was engaged in conversation with a parent, her back to the developing situation. Ian bent forward to retrieve his textbook, his movements careful and dignified despite the circumstances. When he straightened, his expression had hardened into something that spoke of long experience with this kind of casual cruelty. "Thanks for the help," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made Jake's smile falter slightly. "Always appreciate when people show their true character." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, Jake's mask of casual superiority slipped enough to show the insecurity beneath. He'd expected easy submission, comfortable humiliation that would reinforce his position in the social hierarchy. Instead, he'd found quiet strength that refused to be diminished. And that, more than anything else, made him dangerous. The gymnasium's atmosphere had shifted from celebration to something more volatile, like the moments before a thunderstorm when the air becomes charged with invisible electricity. Students continued to mill around, but conversations had taken on a different quality, quieter, more watchful, as if everyone sensed that something was building beneath the surface of normalcy. Jake stood over Ian's wheelchair, his initial attempt at casual dominance having been deflected by Ian's quiet dignity. But rather than retreating, Jake found himself doubled down, his need to maintain his position in the social hierarchy overriding whatever better instincts he might have possessed. The small crowd that had gathered around them seemed to sense the escalation, some students taking unconscious steps backward while others pressed closer, drawn by the magnetic pull of potential conflict. Marco shifted nervously beside Jake, his earlier enthusiasm for the post-assembly celebration having curdled into something that made his stomach twist. He'd seen Jake in moods like this before, moments when his friend's competitive nature took on a harder edge, when his need to. When extended beyond the soccer field into areas where victory and defeat took on different meanings. "You know what your problem is, Professor?" Jake said, his voice carrying that false friendliness that had become his signature tone. "You take everything so seriously. This is supposed to be a celebration, and you're sitting here with your nose in a book like you're too good for the rest." Of us. Ian looked up from his biology textbook, his expression carefully neutral. I'm just reading while everyone else enjoys themselves. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with it. Jake agreed, his smirk widening. But it's kind of antisocial, don't you think? I mean, here we are, celebrating the biggest victory in school history, and you're acting like you'd rather be anywhere else. The accusation was subtle but pointed, designed to put Ian on the defensive while making Jake appear reasonable and inclusive. It was a tactic that had worked for him before, a way of making his targets complicit in their own humiliation by forcing them to defend their choices. I'm here, Ian said simply. I congratulated you on the championship. I'm not sure what else you want from me. Jake's expression flickered with something that might have been frustration. He'd expected Ian to take the bait, to become defensive or argumentative in a way that would justify whatever came next. Instead, Ian's calm responses were making Jake look like the aggressor, a role that didn't fit with his carefully cultivated image as the school's golden boy. What I want, Jake said, his voice dropping to that conversational tone that somehow made his words feel more dangerous, is for you to be part of the team. You know, school spirit and all that. Before Ian could respond, Jake reached out and grasped the handles of Ian's wheelchair. Come on, let's get you closer to the action. Can't have our biggest fan stuck back here in the corner. What happened next would replay in Naomi's memory for years afterward. Jake began to push Ian's wheelchair forward, ostensibly to include him in the celebration, but there was something in the way he did it. Too fast, too forceful, with a kind of theatrical flourish that suggested performance rather than genuine helpfulness. Ian's hands immediately went to his wheel rims, trying to control the movement, but Jake's grip on the handles made it impossible. The wheelchair lurched forward, then spun slightly as Jake attempted what he probably thought was a playful maneuver. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jake, don't, Ian started to say, but his words were cut off as Jake pushed the chair into a quick spin. The physics of the movement were simple but devastating. Ian's hands, trying to grip the wheel rims to control the spin, slipped on the smooth metal. The wheelchair tilted at a dangerous angle, and for a heart-stopping moment, it seemed like it might tip over entirely. Ian's biology textbook flew from his lap, its pages scattering across the gymnasium floor like fallen leaves. His notebook followed, its careful notes and diagrams spreading in a chaotic pattern that spoke of months of meticulous work suddenly rendered worthless. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Some students gasped, others took instinctive steps backward, and a few nervous laughs rippled through the gathered teenagers, the kind of laughter that comes from discomfort rather than amusement. Ian managed to right himself, his face flushed with a combination of physical exertion and deep embarrassment. But it was the look in his eyes that cut through the gymnasium's noise. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of stunned betrayal, as if he'd been struck by someone he'd trusted not to hurt him. Jake stepped back, his expression a mixture of surprise and defensive irritation. Whoa, sorry, man. I was just trying to include you in the celebration. I didn't think you were going to freak out like that. The words were carefully chosen, designed to shift blame while maintaining plausible deniability. Jake's tone suggested that Ian's reaction was the problem, not his actions, and that any reasonable person would have appreciated the gesture. Marco looked genuinely disturbed now, his earlier discomfort having transformed into something closer to horror. He'd seen Jake push boundaries before, but this felt different, more personal, more cruel, more like something that crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. Dude, Marco said quietly, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the gymnasium. That's not. It's fine. Jake interrupted, his voice carrying a sharpness that suggested he didn't want to be challenged. Right, Ian? We're just having fun here. No big deal. But Ian wasn't looking at Jake anymore. He was staring at the scattered pages of his notebook, at the careful diagrams and meticulous notes that represented hours of work, now trampled by feet and marked with the scuff marks of sneakers. His robotics club project, his college application essays, his scholarship applications, all of it mixed together in a chaos that felt symbolic of something larger. Naomi watched from several feet away, her camera hanging heavy around her neck. She'd raised it instinctively when Jake had begun pushing Ian's wheelchair, her photographer's reflexes capturing the moment before her conscience could intervene. Now she stood frozen, horrified by what she'd witnessed, and equally horrified by her own passivity. Coach Simmons observed from his position near the far wall, his arms still crossed, his expression unreadable. A few students had begun to bend down to help collect Ian's scattered papers, but most of the crowd remained frozen in that particular kind of paralysis that comes from witnessing something that crosses the line between acceptable and unacceptable behavior. Principal Hartley was still engaged in conversation with a parent, her back to the situation, unaware that her carefully orchestrated celebration was transforming into something that would define her school's culture for years to come. Ian began to move his wheelchair forward, reaching down to collect his scattered papers. His movements were careful and controlled, his expression settling into the kind of neutral mask that spoke of long experience with public humiliation. But there was something in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he avoided making eye contact with anyone, that suggested the damage went deeper than scattered papers. "Let me help," Naomi said suddenly, her voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence. She knelt beside Ian's wheelchair, gathering pages and trying to organize them in some semblance of order. "It's okay," Ian said quietly, his voice steady despite everything. "I've got it." But as he leaned forward to reach a particularly distant page, his voice cracked slightly, and Naomi saw something that made her chest tighten. Not tears, exactly, but a kind of exhausted resignation that spoke of battles fought and lost too many times before. Jake watched this quiet scene of recovery with an expression that suggested he was already crafting his version of events, already preparing his explanation for how a simple gesture of inclusion had been misinterpreted and blown out of proportion. His smile had returned, but there was something forced about it now, something that didn't quite reach his eyes. "See," he said to the crowd, his voice carrying that same false joviality. "Everything's fine. Ian knows I was just trying to include him. Right, Ian?" But Ian didn't respond. He was focused on his papers, on the careful task of rebuilding order from chaos, on the simple act of gathering his scattered thoughts and materials and dignity into something that could be carried forward. The gymnasium celebration continued around them, but something had changed. The triumph of the soccer team's championship victory had been tainted by something smaller and more personal, but no less significant. The community that had gathered to celebrate excellence had been forced to confront a different kind of truth about itself. And in the quiet space where Ian Mercer gathered his scattered papers, the seeds of a reckoning were beginning to grow. The gymnasium's celebratory atmosphere had fractured into something more complex and uncomfortable. Students moved in smaller groups now, their conversations muted, their glances darting toward the corner where Ian continued to collect his scattered papers. The incident had created a ripple effect that touched everyone present, leaving them to navigate the space between what they'd witnessed and what they were willing to acknowledge. Ian's movements were methodical as he gathered his materials, his face a carefully composed mask that revealed nothing of what he was feeling. His biology textbook was scuffed but intact, though several pages had been torn from his notebook. Years of robotics diagrams, college prep notes, and scholarship essay drafts were mixed together in a chaos that felt representative of something larger than academic materials. Naomi knelt beside his wheelchair, helping to organize the papers, her camera hanging and used around her neck. She'd captured the moment when Jake spun Ian's chair, when the papers scattered, when the crowd's laughter had that particular nervous quality that comes from witnessing something that crosses unspoken boundaries. Now she struggled with what to do with those images, with the weight of being a witness to something that demanded response. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the gymnasium. "I should have said something." Ian glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. "It's not your responsibility to manage other people's behavior." "But I just stood there," Naomi continued, her guilt evident in the way she avoided his eyes. "I took pictures instead of helping. That's not who I want to be." Ian accepted the stack of papers she handed him, his fingers carefully straightening the crumpled edges. "You're helping now. That's what matters." Across the gymnasium, Jake stood with Marco and several other soccer players, his posture radiating. the kind of defensive energy that suggested he was already rewriting the narrative of what had happened. His voice carried that false joviality that had become his signature, but there was something strained about it now, something that suggested he knew he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. I mean, I was just trying to include him, Jake said to his teammates, his tone suggesting that he was the victim of misunderstanding rather than the perpetrator of cruelty. Guy's always sitting by himself, nose in a book. I thought it would be fun to get him involved in the celebration. Marco's expression remained troubled, his earlier enthusiasm for the post-assembly festivities having evaporated entirely. He'd known Jake since middle school, had seen him navigate social situations with the kind of calculated charm that made him popular with teachers and students alike. But this felt different, more personal, more cruel, more like something that revealed aspects of his friend's character that Marco preferred not to acknowledge. That wasn't including him, Marco said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made Jake's smile falter. That was something else. Jake's eyes flashed with irritation. What's that supposed to mean? You know what it means, Marco replied, his discomfort evident in the way he kept glancing toward Ian. You spun his chair like he was some kind of toy. That's not how you treat people. The accusation hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Jake's carefully constructed facade cracked enough to reveal something harder underneath. He'd expected Marco to back him up, to help him craft a version of events that painted him as the misunderstood hero rather than the antagonist. Jesus, Marco, Jake said, his voice dropping to an angry whisper. I was trying to lighten the mood. The guy's always so serious, so separated from everything. I thought it would be good for him to be part of the celebration. By humiliating him in front of half the school, Marco's voice carried a sharpness that surprised both of them. That's not helping anyone. Coach Simmons had been observing the interaction from his position near the far wall, his weathered face showing the kind of careful neutrality that suggested he was trying to balance multiple competing interests. The championship victory was supposed to be a moment of pure triumph, a culmination of years of hard work and dedication. Instead, it was being complicated by questions about character and behavior that extended far beyond the soccer field. He approached the group of players, his expression serious. Everything okay over here? Jake's smile returned instantly, that practiced charm that had served him so well in managing adult relationships. Everything's fine, coach. Just celebrating with the team. But Coach Simmons's eyes had already found Ian across the gymnasium, had taken in the scene of scattered papers and quiet dignity in the face of public humiliation. He'd coached teenage athletes for more than 20 years, had seen how the pressure of success could bring out both the best and worst in young people. The championship doesn't give anyone license to treat others poorly, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of disappointed authority. Success means nothing if we lose sight of basic decency. Jake's expression flickered with something that might have been shame, but it was quickly replaced by defensive irritation. I don't know what you think you saw, but I was just trying to include Ian in the celebration. If he can't handle a little playful interaction, that's not my problem. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Coach Simmons studied Jake's face for a long moment. He'd seen this kind of defensive posturing before, the way young men tried to reframe cruelty as humor, aggression as inclusion. Be smarter. Next time, he said finally, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that ended conversations. Champions are judged by how they treat everyone, not just their peers. Meanwhile, Principal Hartley had finally extricated herself from her conversation with the parent and was beginning to take in the changed atmosphere of the gymnasium. The celebration had lost some of its energy, had fractured into smaller groups that seemed to be engaged in more serious conversations. She'd spent years developing the instincts necessary to read a room, to sense when situations were developing that required administrative intervention. Her eyes found Ian near the wall, still organizing his papers with Naomi's help, and something cold settled in her stomach. She'd missed something, had been too focused on the administrative aspects of the celebration to notice the human dynamics that were playing out among her students. Is everything all right? She asked, approaching Ian and Naomi with the kind of professional concern that suggested she was already preparing for damage control. Ian looked up from his papers, his expression carefully neutral. Just had a small accident with my materials. Nothing serious. Principal Hartley's eyes swept. The scattered papers, taking in the torn pages and scuff marks that suggested something more than a simple accident. Her administrative instincts were telling her that there was more to this story, but the afternoon was already running long, and she had a dozen other responsibilities demanding her attention. "Well, let's make sure you have everything you need," she said, her voice carrying that professional warmth that suggested concern without commitment. "And congratulations on making the honor roll again. Your teachers speak very highly of your work." Ian nodded politely, but there was something in his expression that suggested he understood the subtext of her response, that whatever had happened was being acknowledged but not addressed, recognized but not resolved. As the last of the papers were collected and organized, Ian prepared to leave the gymnasium. His movements were careful and controlled, his expression settling into the kind of neutral mask that spoke of long experience with navigating complex social situations. Naomi watched him go, her camera heavy around her neck, her mind churning with questions about responsibility and witness, about the difference between documentation and action. She'd captured the moment when Jake had spun Ian's chair, when the papers had scattered, when the crowd's reaction had revealed something about the character of their community. Now she had to decide what to do with those images, with the weight of being a witness to something that demanded response. As the gymnasium slowly emptied, the echoes of the celebration mixing with the quieter sounds of cleanup and departure, the events of the afternoon settled into the kind of uncomfortable silence that follows moments of revealed truth. The championship victory would be remembered, celebrated, and enshrined in the school's history. But something else would be remembered too. The moment when a community had been forced to confront the difference between the values it proclaimed and the behavior it tolerated, between the excellence it celebrated and the character it demanded. In the quiet space where Ian Mercer had gathered his scattered papers, the seeds of a reckoning were beginning to grow. The parking lot outside Westridge High was beginning to empty as students filtered toward buses and cars, their voices carrying the mixed energy of a school day that had delivered both triumph and discomfort. The championship celebration had officially ended, but conversations continued in smaller groups, students processing what they'd witnessed in the gymnasium with the kind of careful analysis that teenagers applied to social dynamics. A black sedan pulled into a parking space near the main entrance, its arrival unremarkable except for the quiet precision with which it was maneuvered into position. The driver sat for a moment, studying the school building with the kind of careful attention that suggested both familiarity and distance, someone returning to a place that held significance but had been absent for too long. Steven Seagal stepped out of the car with the fluid grace that had defined his movements for decades. He was dressed simply, dark jeans, a black polo shirt, and a leather jacket that suggested both practicality and style. His hair was longer than it had been in his action movie days, pulled back in a way that emphasized the weathered lines around his eyes and the gravity that had settled into his features with age. At 63, Steven still moved with the controlled power of a martial artist. But there was something different about his presence now, less theatrical, more grounded, as if the years had stripped away everything that wasn't essential and left only the core of who he was. He'd come to Denver to reconnect with Ian, his godson, the boy whose father had been his closest friend before cancer had claimed him too young. The guilt of his absence weighed on Steven like a physical thing. Work had kept him away, movies, television, business obligations that had seemed important at the time, but felt hollow now when measured against the responsibility he'd abandoned. Ian's mother had been gracious about his sporadic presence, but Steven knew he'd failed in the role he'd promised to fill when Ian was born. Today was supposed to be different. A simple lunch, a chance to reconnect, to begin rebuilding the relationship that distance and distraction had eroded. Steven had no way of knowing that he was walking into the aftermath of something that would demand far more from him than casual conversation over sandwiches. The main office of Westridge High buzzed with the efficient energy of administrative staff managing the end of a school day. Secretary Mrs. Patterson looked up from her computer as Steven entered, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to surprised recognition. "Oh my goodness," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone people used when encountering someone famous in an unexpected context. "You're Steven Seagal." Steven nodded politely, his smile warm but measured. "I am. I'm here to see my godson, Ian Mercer." I was hoping to surprise him. Mrs. Patterson's expression brightened with genuine pleasure. Ian's such a wonderful student. Always polite, incredibly bright. Are you here for the championship celebration? The soccer team won regionals. I heard, Steven said, though something in his tone suggested he was more interested in Ian than in athletic achievements. I haven't seen Ian in person for almost a year. Thought it was time to change that. Mrs. Patterson consulted her computer screen, then glanced at the clock. School's officially dismissed, but students are still around. The gymnasium had an assembly, and there's usually some lingering afterward. Would you like me to call him? Down. If it's all right, I'd prefer to find him myself, Steven said. Surprises work better when they're actually surprising. As Steven walked down the main hallway of Westridge High, his presence began to register with the students he passed. Whispers followed in his wake. Cell phones appeared for quick photos, and the kind of excited murmur that accompanies unexpected celebrity sightings rippled through the corridors. Is that really Steven Seagal? What's he doing here? Think. He's making a movie? Steven acknowledged the attention with polite nods, but kept moving, his focus on finding Ian rather than managing his public persona. The hallways of the school felt familiar despite their unfamiliarity. The particular smell of institutional cleaning products and teenage energy, the echo of voices off polished floors, the complex social geography that defined every high school. In America, it was near the gymnasium that Steven encountered Naomi Fields. She was standing outside the doors, her camera hanging around her neck, her expression troubled in a way that suggested she was wrestling with something larger than academic concerns. When she saw Steven approaching, her eyes widened with recognition. But there was something else in her expression, relief, perhaps, at seeing an adult who might be able to help with a situation that felt beyond her ability to handle. "Excuse me," Steven said, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that had served him well both on camera and in real life. "I'm looking for Ian Mercer. Have you seen him?" Naomi's expression shifted, and Steven's trained instincts immediately picked up on the change. There was distress there, and guilt, and something that looked like the aftermath of witnessing something unpleasant. "You're Ian's godfather," Naomi said, the pieces clicking together in her mind. "He's mentioned you." "I am," Steven confirmed, studying her expression more carefully. "Is everything all right? You look upset." Naomi hesitated, glancing back toward the gymnasium doors, then at her camera, then at Steven's face. She was clearly struggling with something, torn between loyalty to her fellow students and a sense that what she'd witnessed demanded adult intervention. "Something happened," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the assembly. With Ian." Steven's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle tightening that suggested his full attention was now focused on her words. "What kind of something?" Naomi pulled out her phone with trembling fingers, scrolling through the photos and videos she'd taken during the assembly. When she found the footage of Jake spinning Ian's wheelchair, of the papers scattering, of the crowd's uncomfortable laughter, she handed the device to Steven without a word. Steven watched the video in complete silence, his expression unreadable. But Naomi, watching his face, saw something that made her stomach tighten. Not anger, exactly, but something colder and more controlled, something that suggested the quiet before a storm. "Where is he now?" Steven asked, his voice still calm, but carrying an undertone that made Naomi understand why people had once feared this man on screen. "He left a few minutes ago," Naomi said. "I think he went to the library. He usually goes there when..." She trailed off, not wanting to finish the sentence. "When he needs space to recover from this kind of treatment," Steven completed, and Naomi nodded. Steven handed the phone back to her, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Thank you for showing me this. What's your name?" "Naomi Fields. I'm on the school newspaper." "And you filmed this?" It wasn't a question, and Naomi felt the weight of judgment in his words. "I should have stopped it. I should have said something. But I just watched." Steven studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Sometimes witnessing is the first step toward action. The question is what you do next." He turned toward the library, then paused. "Naomi?" "Yes, sir?" "Thank you for caring enough to show me." That took courage. As Steven walked away, moving with that same fluid grace, but now with purpose that felt different, more focused, more dangerous, Naomi watched him go and felt something shift in her understanding of what was about to happen. She'd shown Ian's godfather the video because she'd needed an adult to know what had occurred, to take responsibility for addressing it. What she hadn't anticipated was that the adult in question was someone who'd spent decades learning how to handle situations where words weren't enough, where justice required more than administrative intervention. Steven Seagal was walking through the halls of Westridge High School, and everything was about to change. But first, he needed to find Ian. The library at Westridge High occupied a corner of the building that had been designed for quiet contemplation, with large windows that let in natural light and alcoves that provided space for individual study. It was here that Ian had retreated after the gymnasium incident, seeking the kind of sanctuary that books and silence could provide when the social complexities of high school became overwhelming. Steven found him in one of the alcoves, his wheelchair, positioned at a table where he was methodically reorganizing the papers that had been scattered during Jake's playful demonstration. Ian's movements were careful and controlled, but Steven could see the tension in his godson's shoulders, the way his jaw was set with the kind of determination that comes from refusing to let others see how deeply they've wounded you. Ian, Steven said quietly, not wanting to startle him. Ian looked up, and for a moment his carefully composed expression cracked entirely. Surprise, relief, and something that might have been shame flickered across his features before he managed to restore his mask of calm. "Steven," Ian said, his voice carrying a mixture of genuine pleasure and embarrassment. "What are you doing here?" Steven pulled out a chair and sat down, positioning himself at Ian's eye level in a gesture that spoke of practiced understanding of wheelchair etiquette. "I came to take my godson to lunch. Thought it was time we spent some actual time together, instead of just exchanging texts." Ian's smile was genuine but strained. "That sounds great. Let me just finish organizing these notes." Steven watched Ian's hands as they sorted through the papers, noting the careful way he smoothed out wrinkles and tried to restore order to what had been chaos. Some of the pages were torn, others marked with shoe prints, all of them bearing the evidence of having been scattered and trampled. "Naomi Fields showed me a video," Steven said, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent that made Ian's hands still on the papers. Ian's expression closed off immediately, his eyes dropping to his work. It was nothing, just some post-assembly excitement that got a little out of hand. "Ian," Steven's voice carried the kind of authority that came from decades of experience with people trying to minimize their pain. "Look at me." Ian reluctantly met his godfather's eyes, and Steven saw everything he needed to see: the hurt, the embarrassment, the resigned acceptance of treatment that no one should have to endure. "Tell me what happened," Steven said. For a long moment, Ian remained silent, his fingers absently straightening the edge of a torn page. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but hollow. "Jake Redding decided I needed to be more involved in the championship celebration. He thought it would be fun to give me a ride in my chair. Things got a little out of control, and my papers got scattered. No big deal." Steven studied his godson's face, reading the careful way Ian constructed his narrative to minimize both the cruelty he'd experienced and the impact it had on him. It was a survival mechanism that spoke of long practice with similar situations. "And everyone just watched," Steven said. Ian shrugged, a gesture that tried to convey indifference but revealed resignation instead. "People don't know how to react to these situations. It's easier to pretend it's all in good fun than to make it awkward by intervening." The simple acceptance in Ian's voice hit Steven harder than anger would have. His godson had learned to expect so little from the people around him that casual cruelty had become normalized, something to be endured and rationalized rather than confronted and stopped. "Where is Jake now?" Steven asked. Ian's eyes sharpened with alarm. "Steven, please don't make this into something bigger than it is. I have to go to school here every day. Making enemies won't make my life easier." "Sometimes," Steven said, quietly, "making enemies is the only way to stop being a victim." Before Ian could respond, Steven stood and walked toward the library's exit. His movement was fluid and purposeful, carrying the kind of controlled energy that suggested decisions had been made and action was imminent. "Steven, wait," Ian called, but his godfather was already gone. Steven walked through the halls of Westridge High with the measured pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going and what he intended to do when he got there. Students still lingered in various locations, some at lockers, others in small groups engaged in the kind of social debriefing that followed significant school events. His presence drew attention immediately. Whispers followed in his wake. Cell phones appeared for photos and videos, and the energy in the hallways shifted from post-assembly casualness to something more electric and uncertain. Is that really Steven Seagal? What's he doing here? Thinks something's about to go down. Steven ignored the attention, his focus entirely on finding Jake Redding and the teammates who had participated in or witnessed Ian's humiliation. He didn't have to search long. The soccer team was gathered near the trophy case outside the main office, still basking in their championship victory, their voices carrying the particular confidence that came from being the school's heroes. Jake stood at the center of the group, his varsity jacket hanging open, his posture radiating the kind of casual dominance that had served him well throughout his high school career. He was recounting some story that had his teammates laughing, his gestures theatrical and confident. Steven approached the group without announcement, his presence causing conversations to falter and die. The hallway around them began to fill with students drawn by the magnetic pull of potential confrontation, their faces showing the mixture of excitement and apprehension that came from sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Jake Redding," Steven said, his voice carrying easily through the sudden silence. Jake turned, his expression shifting from confidence to surprise to something that might have been nervous excitement. Being addressed by Steven Seagal felt like a moment that would enhance his legend, another story to tell about the day he'd become a champion. "That's me," Jake said, his smile broad and cocky. "Hey, aren't you that action movie guy, Steven Seagal?" "I am," Steven replied, his tone neutral. "I'm also Ian Mercer's godfather." The connection took a moment to register, but when it did, Jake's expression flickered with something that might have been unease. Around them, the crowd of students pressed closer, sensing that this was more than a casual celebrity encounter. "Cool," Jake said, his voice carrying forced enthusiasm. "Ian's a good guy, really smart." Steven studied Jake's face for a long moment, reading the micro-expressions that revealed the young man's growing discomfort. "I saw a video of how you treated him today." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Jake's smile faltered. Slightly, but he was too invested in his public persona to back down completely, too accustomed to talking his way out of difficult situations to immediately recognize the danger he was in. "Oh, that," Jake said, his laugh forced and hollow. "That was just some friendly interaction. Team spirit, you know? I was trying to include him in the celebration." "By spinning his wheelchair like a toy," Steven said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that made several students take unconscious steps backward. Jake's confidence was beginning to crack, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat. "Look, I don't know what Ian told you, but it wasn't a big deal. We were just messing around. If he can't handle a little fun." Steven took a single step forward, and something in that movement made Jake's words die in his throat. It wasn't threatening in any obvious way, but there was something in Steven's posture, in the way he held himself, that suggested controlled power and the willingness to use it. "Let me explain something to you," Steven said, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow carried more weight than shouting would have. "Real strength isn't about humiliating people who can't fight back. Real strength is about protecting those who need protection." Jake's teammates had grown very quiet, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of Steven's controlled intensity. Marco stood slightly apart from the group, his expression showing the internal conflict of someone who knew his friend was wrong but wasn't sure how to intervene. "I wasn't humiliating anyone," Jake protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Now, you were just proving that you're exactly the kind of person who mistakes cruelty for humor," Steven interrupted. "The kind of person who thinks being bigger or more popular gives you the right to treat others as entertainment." The crowd around them had grown larger, students drawn by the magnetic pull of confrontation. Several were recording with their phones, capturing the moment when Westridge High's golden boy found himself facing someone who couldn't be charmed or intimidated. Jake's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He was being lectured in front of his peers, his image as the untouchable champion being dismantled by someone he'd never expected to encounter. His response was predictable, the kind of aggressive posturing that had always worked for him before. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Jake said, his voice rising. "You don't know anything about what happened. You're just some washed-up actor who—" Jake never finished the sentence. In his anger and humiliation, he made the mistake of pushing Steven's chest with both hands, trying to establish physical dominance the way he would with another teenager. What happened next occurred so quickly that most of the watching students missed the mechanics of it entirely. Steven simply redirected Jake's aggressive energy, using an aikido technique that was so subtle it looked almost like Jake had thrown himself to the ground. One moment Jake was pushing, the next he was sitting on the polished floor of the hallway, looking stunned and confused about how he'd gotten there. Steven hadn't struck him, hadn't used any obvious violence. He'd simply used Jake's own force against him, demonstrating in the most basic way possible the difference between real skill and adolescent bluster. The hallway fell completely silent except for the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of Jake's ragged breathing. Students stared in amazement. Teachers began to appear from various classrooms, and the atmosphere shifted from excitement to something more sobering. Steven looked down at Jake, who was still sitting on the floor, his expression a mixture of shock and humiliation. "Violence isn't the answer to anything," Steven said quietly. "But understanding your place in the world is the beginning of wisdom." He turned to address the crowd of students, his voice carrying easily through the silent hallway. "Every one of you who watched what happened to Ian today and did nothing is complicit in his humiliation. Silence in the face of cruelty isn't neutrality, it's endorsement." Steven then walked past Jake, who was still sitting on the floor, and headed back toward the library to find Ian. Behind him, the hallway erupted into whispered conversations and the kind of excited energy that comes from witnessing something that would be talked about for years. But the real confrontation was just beginning. Principal Hartley arrived at the scene to find Jake Redding still sitting on the hallway floor, his expression a mixture of shock and wounded pride, while a crowd of students buzzed with the electric energy that follows unexpected drama. Teachers had begun to appear from various classrooms, drawn by the unusual commotion, and the air was thick with the kind of tension that suggested significant consequences were imminent. "What happened here?" Principal Hartley asked, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to managing teenage crises. The responses came in a confused jumble, multiple voices trying to explain simultaneous events, creating a cacophony that revealed more about the emotional impact of what had occurred than about the specific details. Students talked over each other, their accounts colored by excitement, confusion, and the particular bias that comes from witnessing something that challenges established social hierarchies. Steven Seagal threw Jake to the ground. Jake tried to push him first. He was talking about what happened to Ian. Nobody threw anybody. It was like Jake just fell down. Principal Hartley raised her hand for silence, her expression shifting from administrative concern to something more serious as she began to piece together the implications of what she was hearing. Steven Seagal was at her school. There had been some kind of physical altercation with one of her star athletes, and it was all somehow connected to Ian Mercer. "Where is Mr. Seagal now?" she asked. "He went back toward the library," Marco said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he was still processing what he'd witnessed. Principal Hartley helped Jake to his feet, noting the way his usual confidence had been replaced by something more subdued and uncertain. "Are you hurt?" Jake shook his head, but his movement was mechanical, automatic. The physical impact of hitting the floor was nothing compared to the psychological impact of having his dominance so thoroughly and publicly dismantled. "I want everyone except team members to return to your normal activities," Principal Hartley announced to the crowd. "This situation is being handled." But even as students began to disperse, the energy in the hallways remained charged. Phones had captured video of the confrontation, and the footage was already making its way through social media channels with the viral speed that accompanies anything dramatic enough to break through the ordinary rhythms of teenage life. Steven had returned to the library, where he found Ian exactly where he'd left him, still organizing his scattered papers, but now with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was using the task to avoid thinking about what might be happening elsewhere in the school. "Is it handled?" Ian asked without looking up. Steven sat back down, studying his godson's profile. "It started." "What does that mean?" It means that the people who were content to let you be humiliated are now going to have to decide what kind of community they want to be, Steven said. Change is uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Ian finally looked up, his expression showing a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. You didn't hurt him, did you? I hurt his pride, Steven said. Sometimes that's more effective than hurting anything else. Before Ian could respond, Principal Hartley appeared in the library entrance, her expression showing the kind of controlled stress that comes from managing situations that have the potential to spiral beyond administrative control. Mr. Seagal, she said, her voice professionally cordial but carrying an undertone of tension. I'd like to speak with you. Steven stood, nodding to Ian. We'll continue this conversation later. Principal Hartley led Steven to her office, closing the door behind them and gesturing toward a chair across from her desk. The space was decorated with the kind of motivational posters and academic achievement awards that characterized school administrative offices, but the atmosphere was anything but routine. I understand there was an incident in the hallway. Principal Hartley began, her tone carefully neutral. There was, Steven confirmed. Your student Jake Redding learned what happens when aggression meets actual skill. Principal Hartley's expression tightened slightly. Mr. Seagal, I appreciate your concern for Ian, but physical confrontations on school property are serious matters, regardless of the circumstances. Steven studied her face for a moment, reading the complex mixture of administrative caution and genuine concern that characterized her response. Are you more worried about the confrontation or about the video that shows what your students did to Ian? The question hung in the air between them, and Principal Hartley felt the weight of being forced to confront the difference between managing appearances and addressing actual problems. She'd seen the video that Naomi had shared with the school newspaper, had watched Jake spin Ian's wheelchair while a crowd of students laughed and teachers did nothing. Both, she said finally, her professional composure cracking slightly. What happened to Ian was unacceptable. What happened with Jake was also unacceptable. We need to find solutions that don't involve physical demonstrations. Jake pushed me, Steven said calmly. I redirected his energy in a way that didn't cause injury, but made a point about the consequences of using force inappropriately. It was a teaching moment. Principal Hartley rubbed her temples, feeling the onset of the kind of headache that came from situations that couldn't be resolved through standard administrative procedures. Mr. Seagal, I understand your motivation, but we have policies about your policies, Steven interrupted quietly. Allowed a student in a wheelchair to be humiliated in front of half the school while teachers and administrators watched and did nothing. Maybe it's time to examine whether your policies are serving your students or protecting your institution. The words cut deeper than Principal Hartley wanted to admit. She'd been so focused on the logistics of the championship celebration, so concerned with maintaining the positive energy of the day, that she'd failed to notice or address the cruelty that was happening right in front of her. You're right, she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of professional and personal disappointment. We failed Ian today. We failed as educators and as human beings. Steven's expression softened slightly, recognizing the genuine remorse in her admission. The question is what you do next. What would you suggest? Start by addressing the student body honestly, Steven said. Don't minimize what happened or frame it as a misunderstanding. Call it what it was, cruelty enabled by institutional indifference. Then implement policies that make it clear this behavior won't be tolerated. Principal Hartley nodded, already, beginning to formulate the difficult conversations she would need to have with faculty, parents, and students. And Jake needs to understand that actions have consequences, Steven said. Not just punishment, but real engagement with the impact of his behavior. Community service focused on disability awareness might be more educational than suspension. A knock on the office door interrupted their conversation. Coach Simmons entered, his expression showing the kind of concerned confusion that comes from trying to piece together incomplete information about a situation involving his star player. Dana, he said to Principal Hartley, then nodded to Steven. I heard there was some kind of incident with Jake. Coach Simmons, Principal Hartley said, I think you need to hear about what happened during the assembly today. She played the video that Naomi had provided, and Steven watched Coach Simmons's expression change as he absorbed the reality of what his champion athlete had done. The coach's weathered face showed a progression of emotions, surprise, disappointment, and finally a kind of professional anger that spoke of someone who understood that athletic achievement meant nothing without character. "Jesus," Coach Simmons said quietly when the video ended. "I saw some commotion, but I thought it was just." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "You thought it was just boys being boys," Steven said. "The kind of casual cruelty that gets overlooked because the perpetrators are successful in areas you care about." Coach Simmons's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "You're right. I should have intervened. I should have seen what was really happening." "The question," Steven said, "is what kind of team you want to coach. Champions who think success gives them license to treat others as entertainment, or young men who understand that real strength means protecting those who need protection." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Principal Hartley and Coach Simmons beginning to outline immediate and long-term responses to what had occurred. Policy changes, mandatory training, and a fundamental reassessment of how the school culture prioritized athletics over character. But even as they planned administrative responses, Stephen understood that the real change would need to come from the students themselves, from young people who chose to stand up rather than stand by, who valued human dignity more than social comfort. As he left the principal's office, Stephen knew that his intervention had been only the beginning. The real work of transformation would need to be done by the community itself, one conversation and one choice at a time. But for the first time since arriving at Westridge High, he felt hopeful that Ian might find himself in a school that deserved his presence. The rest of that Tuesday afternoon passed in the kind of hushed tension that follows significant disruptions to established order. Students moved through the hallways with a different energy, their conversations marked by the particular gravity that comes from witnessing something that challenges fundamental assumptions about power and consequence. Jake Redding had left school immediately after the confrontation, his usual post-victory celebration replaced by the kind of retreat that suggests profound reassessment of one's place in the world. His teammates remained behind, clustered in small groups, processing what they'd witnessed with the confused intensity of people whose leader had been publicly humbled. Marco De Leon found himself unable to concentrate on anything else. The image of Jake sitting on the hallway floor, looking stunned and diminished, played on repeat in his mind alongside memories of Ian's scattered papers and the crowd's uncomfortable laughter. For the first time since the championship victory, Marco felt something other than pride about being associated with the soccer team. He found Ian in the library, still organizing his materials with the methodical care of someone using routine to manage emotional turmoil. Marco approached hesitantly, his usual confidence replaced by something that felt uncomfortably like shame. "Ian," Marco said quietly, positioning himself at the table where Ian was working. Ian looked up, his expression neutral but alert. "Marco, I wanted to. I need to." Marco struggled with words that felt inadequate to the situation. "What Jake did today was wrong. What I did, not stopping him, laughing along, that was wrong too." Ian set down the paper he'd been smoothing, giving Marco his full attention. "You're not responsible for Jake's behavior, but I'm responsible for mine," Marco said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse. "I stood there and watched him humiliate you, and I did nothing. Worse than nothing, I was part of it." The admission hung between them, and Ian found himself studying Marco's face, reading the genuine distress there. This wasn't the performative apology of someone trying to avoid consequences, but the real reckoning of a young man confronting his own moral failures. "Why?" Ian asked simply. Marco was quiet for a long moment, struggling to articulate something he'd never examined closely before. "Because it was easier to go along than to stand up. Because I was afraid that standing up for you might make me a target too. Because I cared more about fitting in than about doing what was right." The honesty was brutal and complete, and Ian felt something shift in his understanding of Marco. This wasn't the confident athlete who basked in reflected glory from Jake's leadership, but a young man grappling with the gap between his values and his actions. "What happens now?" Ian asked. "I don't know," Marco said, "but I know I can't pretend this didn't happen. I can't go back to being the kind of person who watches while others get hurt." Their conversation was interrupted by Naomi Fields, who approached their table with the careful energy of someone carrying significant news. Her camera hung around her neck, but her expression suggested she was wrestling with questions that went beyond photography. "Ian," she said, "I need to tell you something. I've written a story about what happened today, about the assembly, about Jake, about how everyone just watched. I want to run it in tomorrow's school paper." Ian's expression tightened with concern. "Naomi, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but making this into a bigger spectacle isn't going to make my life easier." "It's not about making a spectacle," Naomi said, sitting down at their table. "It's about forcing people to confront what happened instead of pretending it was no big deal. What Jake did to you was wrong, but what the rest of us did, standing by and watching, that was wrong too." Marco nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. "She's right. If we just let this get swept under the rug, nothing changes. Jake goes back to being the golden boy, and everyone forgets that anything happened." Ian looked between them, seeing something he'd rarely experienced. Peers who were willing to make his problems their problems, who understood that justice sometimes required uncomfortable confrontations with established systems. "What kind of story?" Ian asked finally. Naomi pulled out her laptop, showing him the draft she'd been working on. The article was titled "When Champions Fall Short: A School's Reckoning with Cruelty and Complicity." It was carefully written, factual without being sensationalized, focused more on the community's response than on individual blame. "I'm not trying to destroy Jake," Naomi explained. "I'm trying to document what happened and ask why it was allowed to happen. The video speaks for itself, but the real story is about how a whole gymnasium full of people watched someone get humiliated and did nothing." Ian read through the article, noting how Naomi had framed the incident not as isolated cruelty but as symptomatic of broader cultural problems within the school. She'd interviewed several students who admitted to feeling uncomfortable during the assembly but not knowing how to intervene, teachers who acknowledged missing the signs of what was happening, and administrators who were already implementing policy changes. "You've already talked to Principal Hartley?" Ian asked. "This afternoon," Naomi confirmed. "She's calling an emergency faculty meeting for tomorrow morning. They're discussing mandatory training on disability awareness and anti-bullying policies. Coach Simmons is requiring the entire soccer team to complete community service hours focused on accessibility advocacy." Marco looked surprised. "Really? Coach didn't mention that at practice." "It was decided after practice," Naomi said. "Your godfather," she said to Ian, "made quite an impression on the administration. I think they realized that ignoring this wasn't an option." Ian felt something complex and unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Not quite hope, but the beginning of possibility. For years, he'd learned to navigate social situations by making himself smaller, by accepting treatment that fell short of respect in order to avoid treatment that was actively hostile. The idea that his experience might be taken seriously, that consequences might follow cruelty, felt almost foreign. "There's something else," Naomi said, her voice carrying a different kind of energy. "The video I took has been shared beyond just our school. It's gotten attention from disability rights advocates, education bloggers, even some local news stations. People are talking about this as an example of institutional failures to protect vulnerable students." Ian's comfort with the situation began to evaporate. "I don't want to be a poster child for anything. I just want to be a regular student who can go to assemblies without being turned into entertainment. That's exactly why this matters," Marco said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "You shouldn't have to choose between being invisible and being a target. There should be a third option where you're just treated like everyone else." Naomi nodded, closing her laptop. "I'm not going to publish anything you're not comfortable with, but I think people need to see what happened, and more importantly, they need to think about their own role in preventing or enabling this kind of treatment." Ian looked at both of them. Marco, whose athletic success had never been questioned, but who was now questioning everything about the culture that had celebrated him, and Naomi, whose camera had captured not just cruelty, but also the possibility of change. For the first time since the assembly, Ian felt something other than isolation. "Publish the story," Ian said finally, his voice steady despite the weight of the decision. "But focus on the community response, not just what happened to me. This isn't about me being a victim. It's about all of us being better." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, understanding that they'd crossed some kind of threshold together. The library around them felt different now, not like a refuge from the complexities of high school social dynamics, but like a planning space for engaging with those complexities in new ways. Stephen appeared in the library entrance, his presence drawing the attention of the few other students who were studying at nearby tables. His expression was calmer than it had been earlier, suggesting that his conversations with Principal Hartley and Coach Simmons had been productive. "Ready for that lunch?" he asked Ian, but his eyes took in Marco and Naomi as well, recognizing them as part of whatever community was forming around his godson. "Actually," Ian said, "I think I'd like Marco and Naomi to join us, if that's okay. We have some things to discuss." Stephen nodded, understanding that the events of the day had created connections that needed to be honored. "The more the better. I know a place that has good burgers and enough space for planning whatever you're planning." As they prepared to leave the library, Marco's phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Need to talk. Can you meet at my house tonight?" Marco showed the message to Ian and Naomi, his expression uncertain. "I should probably go. He's going to need to hear some hard truths, and they'll be easier to hear from a friend." "Be careful," Naomi said. "People don't always handle having their worldview challenged very well." "I know," Marco said. "But if I don't try to help him understand what happened today, who will?" Stephen overheard the conversation and nodded approvingly. Real friendship sometimes means being willing to tell people things they don't want to hear. That takes courage. As the four of them walked toward the school exit, other students watched with the kind of careful attention that suggested they understood something significant was happening. The dynamics of Westridge High were shifting, and everyone could sense it even if they couldn't yet articulate what the changes might mean. In the parking lot, Steven's sedan was surrounded by a small group of students who were examining it with the kind of curiosity that celebrity vehicles attract. When Steven approached, they scattered respectfully but didn't go far, clearly hoping for another glimpse of the man who had turned their school's social hierarchy upside down in the space of 30 minutes. "Is it always like this?" Ian asked, gesturing toward the lingering students. "Fame is complicated," Steven said simply. "But today it served a purpose beyond entertainment. Sometimes having a platform means using it for something that matters." As they drove away from Westridge High, Ian found himself looking back at the building with different eyes. This morning it had been a place where he'd learned to navigate by staying small and unnoticed. Tonight it was beginning to feel like somewhere he might actually belong. The transformation was just beginning, but for the first time in years, Ian allowed himself to believe that it was possible for things to be different. Not perfect, not without continued challenges, but different in ways that mattered. Behind them, in the school they'd left, conversations were happening that would continue long into the evening. Students were sharing videos and debating responses. Teachers were examining their own failures of observation and intervention, and administrators were crafting policies that might prevent future incidents. The ripple effects of Steven Seagal's visit to Westridge High were spreading outward, touching every corner of the school community and forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable questions about the difference between the values they claimed and the behavior they tolerated. Change was coming to Westridge High, whether everyone was ready for it or not. 1 week later, Westridge High felt like a different place. The changes weren't dramatic or obvious. The same hallways, the same lockers, the same fluorescent lighting that had always defined the space. But something fundamental had shifted in the school's atmosphere, something that touched every interaction and conversation. Naomi's article had run on the front page of the school newspaper, accompanied by carefully selected still frames from her video that captured both the cruelty of Jake's actions and the complicity of the watching crowd. The piece had been shared beyond the school community, picked up by local news outlets and education blogs, sparking conversations about disability rights and institutional responsibility that extended far beyond Westridge's walls. The administration's response had been swift and comprehensive. Principal Hartley had addressed the entire student body during an emergency assembly, her words carefully chosen but unflinchingly honest about what had occurred and what it revealed about their school culture. There had been no attempt to minimize or rationalize, just a clear acknowledgement that they had failed one of their students and a commitment to ensuring it wouldn't happen again. New accessibility ramps were already under construction in areas of the school that had been difficult for students with mobility devices to navigate. Posters about inclusivity and respect had appeared throughout the hallways, created not by administration, but by students themselves as part of a school-wide awareness campaign. The Accessibility Club, which had languished with just 3 members for most of the year, suddenly found itself with a waiting list. Jake Redding's transformation had been perhaps the most surprising development of all. His required community service hours were being completed at a local disability advocacy center, where he spent his afternoons learning about the challenges faced by people with various disabilities and the assistive technologies that help them navigate the world. The work was humbling in ways that athletic success had never prepared him for. On this particular afternoon, Jake stood awkwardly outside the robotics club meeting room, a folded piece of paper in his hand and an expression that suggested he was still processing everything that had led him to this moment. Through the open door, he could see Ian working with several other students on what appeared to be a complex engineering project. "Ian," Jake said quietly, stepping into the room. "Could I talk to you for a minute?" Ian looked up from his work, his expression neutral but not hostile. The other club members watched with barely concealed curiosity. This was the first time. Their captain and the soccer team's former golden boy had been in the same room since the assembly incident. "Sure," Ian said, rolling his wheelchair away from the work table. "What's on your mind?" Jake unfolded the paper in his hands, revealing several paragraphs of careful handwriting. "I wrote something. An apology. But not just an apology, a commitment to do better. I was hoping you'd read it." Ian accepted the paper, scanning Jake's words with the same careful attention he brought to his academic work. The letter was longer than expected, detailing not just regret for his actions, but genuine understanding of their impact. Jake had clearly spent considerable time thinking about what had happened and why it was wrong. "This is good," Ian said. "Finally, it sounds like your community service is teaching you things they don't cover in athletic training." Jake's smile was tentative but genuine. "It's been eye-opening. I met a guy yesterday who's a software engineer. He's designed some incredible adaptive interfaces for people with different abilities. Made me realize how narrow my understanding of strength and capability has been." Ian nodded, recognizing the beginning of real change rather than performative contrition. "What you did to me wasn't the worst thing that's ever happened to me, Jake. But it was symptomatic of a culture that sees people like me as either inspirational or pitiable, never just as regular people with regular lives." "I get that now," Jake said, "and I want to help change that culture, if you'll let me." Before Ian could respond, Marco appeared in the doorway, followed by Coach Simmons. The coach's presence in the robotics club room was unusual enough to draw everyone's attention, but his expression suggested this wasn't a casual visit. "Ian," Coach Simmons said, "I wanted to talk to you about something. The soccer team has been discussing ways to make our athletic events more accessible and inclusive. Marco suggested that maybe you could help us audit our facilities and procedures, make recommendations for improvements." Ian looked surprised. "I'm not exactly an expert on sports accessibility, but you're an expert on navigating the world with a disability," Marco said. "And you're obviously brilliant with engineering and problem solving. We need someone who can help us see things we've been missing." Coach Simmons nodded. "It would be a paid consulting position, not much, but something to recognize your time and expertise. What do you think?" Ian found himself looking around the room at faces that had once seemed indifferent or hostile, but now showed genuine interest in his perspective and contributions. The transformation wasn't complete. There were still students and staff members who saw his wheelchair before. They saw him, still moments when he felt isolated or excluded. But something fundamental had shifted. "I'd be interested in that," Ian said. "When would you want to start?" "How about we begin with next week's home game?" Coach Simmons suggested. "You could observe our current setup, identify areas for improvement, and help us create a better experience for all our fans." As the conversation continued, Steven Seagal watched from the hallway, having arrived for another lunch with Ian. He didn't interrupt the planning session, content to observe the community his godson was building around himself, not through pity or special accommodation, but through recognition of his actual contributions and capabilities. The changes at Westridge High weren't perfect or complete. Real cultural transformation took time, sustained effort, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about ingrained attitudes and assumptions. But watching Ian collaborate with former tormentors who had become genuine allies, Steven felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope that institutional change was possible when individuals chose courage over comfort. 3 weeks after Steven Seagal's unexpected visit to Westridge High, the school gymnasium once again filled with students, teachers, and parents. But this assembly felt different from the championship celebration that had preceded it. More thoughtful, more intentional, weighted with the kind of gravity that comes from communities grappling seriously with their values. The decorations were simpler this time. Banners reading "Strength through Respect" and "Champions of Character" hung alongside displays created by various student clubs highlighting different aspects of diversity and inclusion. The energy in the room was quieter but more substantial, suggesting conversations that went deeper than surface-level celebration. Principal Hartley stood at center court, her expression showing the confidence that comes from leadership tested and refined by crisis. 3 weeks ago, we gathered in this gymnasium to celebrate athletic achievement. Today, we gather to celebrate something more important: our commitment to becoming the kind of community that deserves all of our students. The applause was measured but genuine, lacking the frenzied excitement of the previous assembly but carrying more weight. Students listened with the attention that comes from understanding that what was being discussed actually mattered to their daily lives. "I want to begin," Principal Hartley continued, "by acknowledging that we failed in our responsibility to protect and respect all members of our community. That failure has led to important conversations and meaningful changes, but it began with our willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves." She gestured toward a small group of students seated in the front row, Ian, Naomi, Marco, and Jake among them. "These students have shown us what leadership actually looks like. Not the kind that seeks applause or attention, but the kind that asks difficult questions and works toward better answers." Ian felt the familiar discomfort of being singled out, but there was something different about this attention. Rather than being positioned as either victim or inspiration, he was being recognized as a contributing member of a community that was learning to value different kinds of strength. Jake stood to address the assembly, his usual swagger replaced by something more substantial. "I want to talk about what I learned when I stopped thinking about strength as something you use against other people and started thinking about it as something you use to help them." His speech was brief but honest, describing his community service work and the misconceptions he'd held about disability and capability. When he finished, the applause was thoughtful rather than enthusiastic, the recognition that growth was more important than perfection. Marco followed, talking about the difference between following leaders and choosing to lead. "For too long, I let other people define what loyalty meant. Real loyalty means holding your friends accountable when they're wrong and standing up for people who need support." Naomi spoke about the responsibility that comes with witnessing, about the choice between documenting problems and working toward solutions. Her words carried the weight of someone who had learned that journalism was about more than capturing dramatic moments. It was about fostering the conversations that communities needed to have with themselves. Finally, Ian rolled his wheelchair to the microphone. The gymnasium fell completely silent. Every face turned toward him with the kind of attention that suggested they understood the significance of the moment. "I've been a student here for almost 4 years," Ian began, his voice steady and clear. "For most of that time, I felt like I was trying to earn the right to belong somewhere that wasn't sure it wanted me. Today feels different, not because everything is perfect, but because we're finally talking honestly about the kind of school we want to be." He paused, looking out at faces that had once seemed indifferent but now showed genuine engagement. With his words, "Real strength isn't about being the biggest or the loudest or the most successful. It's about how you treat people who can't do anything for you. It's about choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier. It's about building communities where everyone's contributions are valued." The applause that followed was unlike anything Ian had experienced at Westridge High. Not polite acknowledgement or sympathetic response, but genuine appreciation for ideas that resonated with shared values. As the assembly concluded, students didn't rush for the exits as they had 3 weeks earlier. Instead, they lingered in small groups, continuing conversations that had been started from the stage. Teachers moved among them, facilitating discussions rather than managing crowds. Steven Seagal watched from the back of the gymnasium, having slipped in quietly to observe the community his intervention had helped to create. What he saw was more powerful than any action sequence he'd ever filmed. Real people choosing to be better versions of themselves, institutions adapting to serve all their members rather than just their most successful ones. Ian approached him as the gymnasium began to empty, his expression showing a contentment that Steven had rarely seen in his godson's face. "Thank you," Ian said simply. "For what?" "For showing me that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let people see who you really are." Steven smiled, placing a hand on Ian's shoulder. "You did that all by yourself. I just made sure people were paying attention." As they walked out of the gymnasium together, Steven felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction that comes from using whatever power you possess in service of something larger than yourself. The cameras would never capture this moment, the headlines would never celebrate this victory, but real change had occurred in this place, one conversation and one choice at a time. Behind them, Westridge High continued its work of becoming the kind of community that deserved all of its students, not through grand gestures or perfect solutions, but through the daily practice of treating every person with the dignity and respect that made genuine belonging possible. The reckoning was complete, but the real work of building something better was just beginning. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.